My name is Cordelia Ainsworth Pemberton. I am 40 years old. And the morning I discovered that my older brother had forged my father's signature on the third page of the will that we had buried our father with, not literally, but in the way that lawyers and adult children always speak about the document they read in the days after a parent dies, as if the document itself were the parent's last word and the burying of it had been part of the funeral, was a Wednesday morning in late August, 4 months after my father's death, in the offices of a forensic document examiner on Boylston Street in Boston. The forensic document examiner's name was Mr. Tomasik. He was 63 years old. He had spent 31 years analyzing handwriting for the FBI before retiring to private practice, and his office was a small, unremarkable room on the 7th floor of a building that I had walked past, without noticing, perhaps 200 times in the years I had lived in the Back Bay. The office had 3 filing cabinets, a desk, a high-intensity examination lamp, and a series of magnification instruments that I had never seen before in my life and that I would, in the months that followed, come to know better than I had ever wanted to. I had brought him 3 documents. The first was a copy of my father's will. 47 pages. The will I had read in the offices of the family attorney 4 months earlier, in the room with my brother Lyle and my sister Beatrice and my father's longtime attorney Mr. Heath, in the days after the funeral. The second was a stack of my father's actual signed correspondence. 68 documents I had collected over 4 months. Letters, cards, birthday notes, Christmas cards, old contracts, anything and everything that bore my father's actual handwriting, dated and verifiable, from the past 40 years of his life. The third was a single piece of paper I had found, 3 weeks earlier, in a manila envelope at the back of my father's desk drawer, in the study of the house in Beacon Hill where I had grown up, on a Saturday afternoon when my mother had been at her bridge club and the housekeeper had been off and I had been alone in the house for the first time since the funeral. The single piece of paper was a draft of page 3 of my father's will. It was dated 6 months before my father's death. It contained provisions that did not appear in the version of the will that had been read aloud in Mr. Heath's office. The signature at the bottom of the draft page was my father's signature. And the signature at the bottom of page 3 of the will that had been filed with the probate court, the will Mr. Heath had read aloud to my brother and my sister and me on a Tuesday morning in May, was, I had begun to suspect, also my father's signature. But not the same one. I had brought all 3 documents to Mr. Tomasik on a Wednesday morning in late August. I had paid him a retainer of $3,200 in cash, drawn from a checking account my brother did not know about, because I had been advised by the attorney I had retained for this purpose that the cash payment would prevent any record of the transaction from generating a paper trail that could, by various means, eventually be traced back to me. Mr. Tomasik had spent 4 hours examining the 3 documents. When he was finished, he turned off the high-intensity examination lamp. He removed his spectacles. He set them down on the desk. He looked at me with the specific careful patience of a man who had been delivering difficult news to clients for 31 years, and who had learned that the most important thing in the delivery was the absence of drama. He said, "Mrs. Ainsworth Pemberton, the signature on page 3 of the filed will is not your father's signature." I sat very still. I said, "You are certain?" He said, "I am certain. The signature on the filed will exhibits 17 specific characteristics that distinguish it from the 68 authentic signatures you provided me. The pen pressure is wrong. The slant is wrong. The terminal stroke of the L is wrong. The connection between the second and third letters of the surname is wrong. There are 11 additional characteristics that I would be happy to walk you through in detail, but I want to give you the headline first." He said, "The signature is a forgery." He said, "The forgery is, in my professional opinion, the work of someone who had access to your father's authentic signatures and who practiced the forgery for some time before producing the version that appears on the document." He said, "It is a competent forgery." It is not, however, a forgery that would withstand expert analysis. He paused. He said, Mrs. Ainsworth Pemberton. I said, yes. He said, the draft page you found in the desk drawer. The one with the authentic signature. That signature is, in my opinion, your father's actual signature. The provisions on the draft page are different in significant ways from the provisions on the filed page 3. I do not know what those differences mean from a legal perspective. I would recommend you take both documents to your attorney as quickly as you can. He said, I would also recommend you do not discuss what I have told you with anyone other than your attorney. Not your siblings. Not your mother. Not your husband. He said, you are now, technically, a party in possession of evidence of a felony. I left the office on Boylston Street at 3:45 in the afternoon. I walked to my car. I drove home. I did not call my brother. I did not call my sister. I did not call my husband Charles, who was at his office in Cambridge and who I had not yet decided how I was going to tell. I drove to the small carriage house behind the home in Beacon Hill where Charles and I lived, and I parked in the small private courtyard, and I sat in my car for 45 minutes. I sat in my car because I was thinking about my father. I was thinking about my father because the conversation with Mr. Tomarsik had just confirmed something I had been afraid of since the day of the will reading, and the confirmation was not a relief. The confirmation was the beginning of a long series of decisions that I was now going to be required to make, and the decisions were going to involve my brother, who I had loved my whole life, and who had, in the 4 months since our father's death, done something to me and to my sister and to our mother that none of us had yet fully understood. Stay with me. If this is your first time on the channel, my name is Cordelia. Welcome. This is Silent Will Stories. The stories I tell here are stories about the rooms where most people did not know to look. If something in this story finds you tonight, drop one word in the comments. Drop your city. Drop the time. I read every comment in the early morning before the rest of the house wakes up. Let me take you back. Not to the desk drawer. Not to the office on Boylston Street. Let me take you back 40 years, to a brick house on Mount Vernon Street in Beacon Hill, on a winter afternoon in 1985, where a small girl was sitting at the dining room table doing her math homework while her mother poured tea for 2 of her mother's friends in the front parlour, and her older brother, who was 13 years old, was upstairs in his bedroom doing what older brothers did in 1985 in the bedrooms of houses on Mount Vernon Street, which is to say almost nothing of any particular use. The small girl was me. The math homework was real. My older brother Lyle was, at 13, already the kind of boy who occupied the upstairs of the house with the assumption that the upstairs of the house had been built around him. He was the firstborn. He was the only son. He was the inheritor, not yet, in 1985, of anything specific, but in the broader sense in which firstborn sons of Boston families like ours were the inheritors of the family's general orientation toward the world. Lyle was being prepared, in the long quiet way that Boston families prepared their sons, for an adult life in which his judgment would be consulted, his interests would be accommodated, and his opinions would be received with the specific deference that the family had been paying to firstborn sons for the previous 4 generations. I was being prepared for something else. I was being prepared, by my mother and my father in different and not entirely compatible ways, for an adult life in which I would be a Pemberton woman. The Pemberton women of Beacon Hill had been a particular kind of woman for 160 years. They had been the wives of doctors and judges and university presidents and bankers. They had run charitable foundations. They had hosted dinner parties. They had managed the social calendars of their husbands' careers. They had raised children who, in their turn, had become the next generation of Pembertons. The Pemberton women had not, traditionally, been the inheritors of the Pemberton money. The Pemberton money had passed, by tradition and by a series of trust documents that had been drafted in the 1920s by an attorney who had been my great-grandfather's college roommate at Harvard, through the male line. I had understood this from a very early age. I had not, for most of my life, had any particular complaint about it. My father, however, had been complaining about it for 30 years. I want to tell you about my father. My father was a man named Bradford Ainsworth. He had married my mother, Catherine Pemberton, in 1972. He had taken her name, hyphenated it with his own, and had become, in the eyes of Boston society, the man who had married into one of the older families and who had spent the subsequent 5 decades adjusting to the specific quiet humiliations of being the man who had married in. He was a kind man. He was a thoughtful man. He had been a partner at a small Boston law firm for 36 years. He had been, more importantly, the parent who had paid attention to me in the long quiet years of my childhood when my mother had been busy with her social calendar and my brother had been busy with the upstairs of the house. My father had paid attention to me. He had taught me chess. He had taught me how to read a balance sheet. He had taught me, when I was 11 years old, the specific mechanics of how trust documents were structured and why the trust documents that controlled the Pemberton money had been written the way they had been written. He had not been happy about it. He had told me, many times, in the small careful conversations he had with me in his study after dinner, that the Pemberton tradition of parsing the money through the male line was the kind of tradition that had made sense in 1923 and that had not, in any meaningful way, continued to make sense since approximately 1965. He had told me that he would, when his own time came, attempt to use whatever discretion he had within the constraints of the trust documents to address the imbalance. He had been unable to address the imbalance during the lifetime of my grandfather, who had been the trustee of the primary Pemberton Trust until his death in 2007, and who had been a man of 1923 in his thinking until the day he had died at the age of 93. After my grandfather's death, my father had become a co-trustee with my mother. My mother, despite being a Pemberton, was a woman of the old tradition. My mother believed that the money should pass to Lyle. My mother had told me this on several occasions over the decades, in the specific gentle tone that she used when she was telling me something she expected me to absorb without making it inconvenient for her. My father had spent the years between 2007 and his death in 2024 attempting to negotiate, with my mother and with Mr. Heath and with the broader structure of the trust, a different distribution. He had not, during his lifetime, succeeded. What I had not understood, until the Wednesday morning in Mr. Tomarsik's office, was that my father had succeeded, in the months before his death, in drafting a specific provision that would have changed the distribution of the estate. He had drafted it. He had signed it. And then, sometime between the moment he signed it and the moment the will was filed with the probate court, the page containing that provision had been replaced. The replacement page contained a different provision. The replacement page contained a signature that was not my father's. The replacement page had been substituted by someone with access to the will between the time of my father's death and the time of the filing. There were, in a strict sense, only 4 people with that level of access. My mother, Mr. Heath, my brother Lyle, and a paralegal at Mr. Heath's firm named Vivian Cox, who had handled the day-to-day administration of my father's estate planning for the previous 11 years. I had spent the 4 months since my father's death building, very carefully, my understanding of which of those 4 people had done it. I had eliminated my mother by the end of June. My mother did not have the capacity, the technical knowledge, or the motivation to forge a signature. My mother, additionally, had been so visibly devastated by my father's death that the suggestion of her participation in any kind of strategic action during that period was, to anyone who knew her, simply unimaginable. I had eliminated Mr. Heath by the middle of July. Mr. Heath was 68 years old. He had represented my family for 31 years. He had, in the conversation we had in his office in early July when I had asked him a series of carefully constructed questions about the will, demonstrated the specific reactions of a man who was not aware that anything unusual had occurred. He had also, in subsequent inquiry through a contact at the Massachusetts Bar Association that I had developed for this purpose, been determined to have an unblemished 31-year record of professional conduct. I had eliminated Vivian Cox by the end of July. Vivian Cox was a 46-year-old paralegal who had worked at Mr. Heath's firm for 16 years. She had no apparent motivation to alter the distribution of the Pemberton estate. She had, additionally, been on a vacation in Portugal during the specific window of time in which the substitution would have had to occur. That left my brother Lyle. Lyle was, by August, the person I had been quietly examining for 4 months. I had not yet told Lyle that I was examining him. I had not yet told my mother. I had not yet told my sister Beatrice. I had not yet told my husband Charles. I had, in fact, told only one person. The person I had told was the attorney I had retained for this purpose, a woman named Bryony Holloway Schuster, who practiced trusts and estates litigation in Boston, and who had been recommended to me by a friend at Harvard Business School who had used her successfully in a similar matter 8 years earlier. Bryony was 47 years old. She had spent 12 years at a large Boston firm before founding her own practice. She had a reputation, in the Boston trusts and estates community, for being the attorney that the female members of old families called when they suspected that the male members of old families had begun to behave in ways that the trust documents did not authorize. She had been my attorney for 3 months by the morning of the Wednesday at Mr. Tomasik's. I called her from the carriage house at 4:30 that afternoon. I said, "Bryony, the signature on page 3 is a forgery." She said, "Cordelia, are you somewhere safe?" I said, "I am at home." She said, "Is Charles there?" I said, "Charles is at his office. He will be home at 6:30. She said, "Cordelia, listen to me carefully. I want you to do 3 things in the next 2 hours." She said, "First, I want you to make a copy of the report Mr. Tomarsik gave you. I want you to put the copy in a sealed envelope. I want you to take the envelope to your safe deposit box at the bank tonight, before you do anything else, before you talk to Charles, before you sleep." She said, "Second, I want you to bring the original report and the original draft document to my office tomorrow at 9 in the morning. I have already cleared my schedule. We will spend the day building the legal architecture of what comes next." She said, "Third, when Charles comes home tonight, I want you to tell him what we have found. I want you to tell him because Charles is your husband and he deserves to know. But I want you to tell him in a way that makes clear to him that he is not to speak to anyone in your family about what he has learned. Not your mother. Not your brother. Not your sister. Not for any reason. Not until I tell you it is time." She said, "Charles is going to want to act protectively. Charles is going to want to confront Lyle. We are not going to allow that." I said, "Bryony, what is going to happen?" She said, "Cordelia, what is going to happen is going to depend on a lot of things." She said, "But the first thing that is going to happen is that we are going to know." She said, "Tonight, you are going to know. Tomorrow, I'm going to know. By the end of next week, the forensic record is going to be airtight, the legal architecture is going to be in place, and we are going to be ready to make the next decision." She said, "The next decision is going to be yours. I'm going to lay out the options. I'm going to tell you what each option costs and what each option achieves. You are going to decide what kind of family you want to have on the other side of this." She said, "Cordelia, I want you to know one thing tonight." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your father was on your side. He was on your side until the day he died. The provision he drafted, the signature he put on it, the document he placed in the desk drawer where you eventually found it. All of that was your father telling you, across the boundary of his death, that he saw you. That he had spent his life trying to address the imbalance. That he had, in the end, succeeded in drafting the address." She said, "The fact that someone removed the provision after he died does not change what your father did. Your father did the right thing. He spent 30 years preparing to do it. He did it." She said, "We are going to make sure his work was not for nothing." I said, "Bryony. Thank you." She said, "Cordelia. Go to the bank." I went to the bank. I made a copy of the report. I sealed it in an envelope. I deposited the envelope in the safe deposit box that Charles and I had kept at the State Street Trust for the previous 14 years, and that contained, among other things, the deed to our house, our marriage certificate, the birth certificates of our 2 children, and now the document that was going to determine the future of my relationship with my brother for the rest of our lives. I drove home. Charles was already home when I arrived. He had come home early. He had come home early because, he told me when I walked in the door, I had sounded strange on the phone the night before, and he had been thinking about it all day, and he had decided to come home and see whether anything was wrong. I told him to sit down at the kitchen table. I told him everything. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I was done, he said, "Cordelia, what do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to not do anything. I need you to not call Lyle. I need you to not say anything at the dinner with my mother on Sunday. I need you to be the husband who knows this and who is patient." He said, "Cordelia, I can do that." He said, "I want to ask you one question." I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know yet what you want?" I said, "Charles, I do not know yet what I want. I will know in the next 2 weeks. I will tell you when I know." He said, "That is fine." He said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too." He made dinner that night. We ate together at the kitchen table in the carriage house. We did not talk about the report. We did not talk about the will. We talked about our children, who were 9 and 7 and were upstairs doing their homework, and we talked about a small renovation we had been planning for the kitchen, and we talked about the trip to Maine we had been thinking about taking in October. We went to bed at 10 o'clock. I did not sleep for a long time. I lay in bed beside my husband, and I thought about my brother, and I thought about my father, and I thought about the long careful work my father had done in the last months of his life to address an imbalance that he had been unable to address during all the decades when he had been alive to fight for it. He had drafted the provision. He had signed it. He had put a copy in the desk drawer in his study, in a manila envelope, where I would, eventually, find it. He had done all of that knowing that someone in the family was capable of removing it after he died. He had done it anyway. He had trusted me to find what he had left. I had found it. I was going to use it. I want to tell you what we found in the next 2 weeks. I want to tell you because the finding is the part of this story that, in the years I have been thinking about it since, has remained the part one most want to give to other women who are sitting in a similar place in their own families. The finding is that the brother who forges his father's will is, almost always, a man who has been in financial trouble for a long time without anyone in the family knowing. The forgery is not the disease. The forgery is the symptom. I did not know any of this when I walked into Bryony's office on the Thursday morning following the Wednesday at Mr. Tomasik's. I knew only that my brother had altered a document. I had assumed, in the careful way I had been building my theory of the case for 4 months, that the alteration had been a kind of straightforward greed. The provision my father had drafted was going to redistribute approximately 43% of the estate from Lyle to me and to Beatrice. 43% of the Pemberton estate, by the most recent valuation Mr. Heath had shared with us, was approximately $7.8 million. Lyle had altered the document, I had assumed, because he wanted the $7.8 million. That assumption was not wrong. It was incomplete. By the end of the second week of August, Bryony's investigators had assembled a fuller picture, and the fuller picture changed the shape of what I was dealing with. My brother Lyle was a hedge fund manager. He had founded his own fund in 2009. The fund had been moderately successful for the first 8 years. It had performed below the market for the next 4 years. By 2021, the fund had been losing investors quarter over quarter for 2 years, and Lyle had been compensating for the loss of management fees by taking increasingly aggressive positions on illiquid securities. In 2022, Lyle had taken a series of positions that had cost the fund approximately 40% of its remaining assets under management. In 2023, Lyle had borrowed personally against his anticipated inheritance from our father. The lender was a private credit firm in Greenwich, Connecticut, that specialized in pre-inheritance lending to wealthy families. The amount of the loan was $4.2 million. The loan was secured against Lyle's expected share of our father's estate, which, under the will Lyle had been operating under at the time of the loan, was approximately 62% of the total. The loan was due in installments over 6 years. The first installment, of $900,000, was due in October of 2024. October of 2024 was 3 months after the will was filed. If our father's actual will had been filed, the will containing the provision he had drafted to address the imbalance, Lyle's inheritance would have been reduced from 62% to approximately 19%. The reduction would have rendered the $4.2 million loan, technically and immediately, in default. Lyle would have had no way to make the October payment. Lyle would have been required to disclose the default to his fund's remaining investors. The disclosure would have ended his career. Bryony explained all of this to me on a Tuesday afternoon in her office, with the September light coming through her windows behind her, while her investigators sat across from us with the documentation they had assembled over the previous 2 weeks. She said, "Cordelia, your brother did not forge the page because he wanted $7.8 million in additional inheritance." She said, "Your brother forged the page because the alternative was financial ruin." She said, "I am not telling you this to excuse what he did. What he did was a felony. What he did was a betrayal of your father. What he did was a betrayal of you and of Beatrice. What he did was a betrayal of your mother, who he allowed to read aloud, at the family lunch following the will reading, the version of the will he had altered." She said, "I am telling you this because the strategic choice you are about to make is going to depend on whether you understand what you are choosing." She said, "You can prosecute. We have what we need. The forensic report. The draft page. The financial trail showing his motive. We can have the district attorney involved within 10 days. Your brother will be arrested. Your brother will be charged. Your brother will go to trial. Your brother will, with very high probability, go to prison for between 3 and 7 years." She said, "That is one option." She said, "A second option is civil. We file in probate to invalidate the filed will. We submit the forensic report and the draft page as evidence. The court invalidates the substituted page. The actual provision your father drafted is reinstated. Your brother is required to repay the $7.8 million redistribution. Your brother's loan goes into default. His career ends." She said, "The civil option achieves the same financial outcome as the criminal option. It is faster. It is less public. It does not require your testimony at a criminal trial. It does, however, lead to the same end state for your brother professionally. She said, a third option is private. I said, tell me. She said, we confront your brother. With the evidence. With the legal exposure. With the financial reality. We give him a structured choice. We give him the choice to enter into a private settlement with the family that achieves the redistribution your father intended, that allows him to repay the loan through a structured arrangement, that requires him to admit what he did to you and to Beatrice and to your mother, and that does not result in a criminal record or in the public destruction of his fund. She said, the private option is the most complicated. The private option requires you and Beatrice and your mother to be in agreement. The private option requires Lyle to be willing to participate. The private option requires you to make a choice about whether you want to remain in the same family with Lyle for the rest of your life under conditions that, while corrected, will never be the same as they were. She said, the private option is the option in which you, Cordelia, become the person who saved your brother from himself. She said, it is also the option that costs you the most. She paused. She said, I do not have a recommendation for you, Cordelia. The three options are all defensible. The three options are all what your father would have wanted you to consider. Your father drafted the provision. He did not draft an instruction for what to do if the provision was removed. He left that to you. I sat in Bryony's office. I sat with the question of what kind of family I wanted to have on the other side of this. I sat with the question for a long time. I want to tell you what I considered, because the consideration is the part of this story that I think about most often. I considered the prosecution. I considered Lyle in handcuffs. I considered the local newspapers covering the trial. I considered the satisfaction of seeing my brother held accountable in a public way that the family had never held anyone accountable in for 160 years. I considered it for a long time. I considered the civil action. I considered the cleaner version of accountability. The probate court invalidating the substituted page. The career ending without the prison sentence. The faster timeline. The less public trial. I considered it for a long time. And then I considered the third option. I considered Lyle. My brother Lyle. The boy upstairs in the bedroom on Mount Vernon Street in 1985. The teenager who had taken me to my first concert when I was 14 and he was 20. The man who had walked me down the aisle at my wedding because her father had been ill that week and the family had decided that Lyle would stand in the role. The brother who had, despite everything that had become true about him in the previous decade, been my brother for 40 years. I considered the loving. I considered the loving the way Reese had considered the loving in the parking lot. I considered that the loving had been real. I considered that the loving was now also, simultaneously, the architecture of the betrayal. I considered that I was going to have to hold both of those facts for the rest of my life. I considered what kind of woman I wanted to be on the other side of the holding. I considered what kind of mother I wanted to be to my children, who would, in the years that followed, ask me about their uncle. I considered what kind of daughter I wanted to be to my mother, who would, in the years that followed, attempt to absorb whatever had happened in the way that mothers of complicated families absorb things, by simplifying them and protecting the children from the simplification. I considered all of it. I made the decision. I said, Bryony. We do the third option. She said, Cordelia. I said, I want you to draft the structured settlement. I want you to draft it in a way that achieves the full redistribution my father intended. I want you to draft it in a way that requires Lyle to admit what he did to me and to Beatrice and to my mother. I wanted to require him to repay the loan through a structured arrangement that we will design with him in the room. I said, I want him to know that the prosecution remains an option. I want the settlement document to include a provision that, in the event of any future material breach, the criminal record we have built becomes immediately admissible. I said, I want, at the end of all of it, the option to remain his sister. I said, I do not know yet whether I will use that option. I said, but I want it to be available. She said, Cordelia. That is the right answer. She said, I'm going to draft it tonight. She said, I'm going to be ready to confront him with you on Friday. The confrontation happened on a Friday afternoon in mid-September. I will tell you about it briefly because the confrontation itself is not the part of this story that I most want you to remember. We met in Bryony's office. Lyle came alone. He had been told only that I had requested a meeting to discuss certain matters relating to the estate. He had been told the meeting would include legal counsel. He had not been told what we knew. When he walked into the conference room and saw me sitting at the table beside Bryony, with a forensic report and the draft page laid out in front of us, his face did the thing. He did not deny it. He did not even attempt to deny it. He sat down across from us. He said, Cordelia. I said, Lyle. He said, how did you find it? I said, I found the draft page in Daddy's desk drawer in July. I had it analyzed. He said, I see. He sat with what he had said for a moment. Then he said, Cordelia. I want you to know that I have been waiting for this conversation for 4 months. I have been waiting for it because I knew, at some point, you were going to find it. I knew because Daddy made sure you would find it. I knew because Daddy spent the last 6 months of his life telling me, in small careful ways that he knew I would understand only after he was gone, that he had drafted the provision and that he had placed something in the house that would make sure the provision was honored. He said, I removed the page anyway. He said, I removed the page because I had no other option. He said, I'm going to spare you the financial details. I am sure your attorney has assembled them. Bryony said, we have. Lyle said, then you understand. I am not going to argue. I'm going to tell you what I want. I said, what do you want, Lyle? He said, Cordelia. I want to deserve the third option. He said, I assume you have constructed 3 options. I have spent for months thinking about what they would be. I assume one of them is criminal prosecution. I assume one of them is civil litigation. I assume one of them is something else. He said, I want the something else. He said, I am going to tell you why I want it. Not because I deserve it. Because I do not deserve it. I want it because I have a wife. I have 2 children. I have a mother who would not survive the prosecution. He said, I have spent for months carrying what I did. I have spent 4 months trying to figure out how I was going to repay the loan when the conversation we are now having happened. He said, I am going to accept whatever the third option costs me. He said, I am asking you to give me the chance to take it. I looked at my brother across the table. I looked at the man who had walked me down the aisle. I looked at the boy who had taken me to my first concert. I looked at the brother who had spent 40 years in a family that had been quietly grooming him for an inheritance he had been unable to deserve. I said, Lyle. I said, I want you to know one thing before I tell you what comes next. I said, I am not doing this because I love you. I have not yet figured out whether I love you. I will figure that out over the next several years. I am doing this because Daddy spent the last 6 months of his life giving me the option to do this. He did not have to give me the option. He could have left me only the choice between prosecuting you and not prosecuting you. He gave me the third option. He gave it to me, I think, because he believed that the third option was the option that would let our family survive him. I said, I am taking the option he gave me. I am not taking it for you. I am taking it for him. I said, you are going to live with the knowledge of that for the rest of your life. I said, that is the cost. Lyle did not respond for a long moment. Then he said, Cordelia, I will pay it. I said, Bryony, show him the document. Bryony slid the document across the table. Lyle read it. He read it twice. He picked up the pen. He signed it. I want to tell you what was in the settlement. I will tell you only the parts that mattered. The provision my father had drafted was reinstated, by mutual agreement of all four parties to the estate. The redistribution proceeded as he had intended. Lyle's share went from 62% to 19%. My share and Beatrice's share each rose from 9% to 35%. My mother's portion, which had been managed separately, remained unchanged. Lyle's loan was restructured. He was given a 5-year window to repay it. The collateral was modified to reflect his actual 19% share. The interest rate was adjusted upward as a condition of the restructuring. Lyle was required to make a written admission to me, to Beatrice, and to our mother of what he had done. The admission was kept private to the family. It was filed with Bryony's office in a sealed envelope that would, in the event of any future breach, be released as part of the criminal evidence package. Lyle was required to step down as managing partner of his fund. He retained a non-managing equity stake. The fund was restructured under new leadership. Lyle moved into a non-public role within the firm in which his judgment did not directly determine investment positions. He was, by the operation of the settlement, no longer the financial center of his own household. He had to learn to live in his own family the way he had not learned to live in our family, which was to say without the assumption that he was the inheritor. He spent the next 3 years learning it. I do not know whether he learned it well. I know that he is still my brother. I know that I have, in the 4 years since the confrontation, slowly begun to find something in him that resembles, if not the brother he had been before, a different brother who had been buried underneath the brother he had been before. The new brother is quieter. The new brother is, in some specific ways, a better brother than the old one had been. The new brother is the brother my father, in his own way, had been hoping the old brother could become. I do not know if my father had imagined that the becoming would require the events I have described. I think he had. I think, at the end of his life, he had understood that his son was going to have to face a reckoning, and he had drafted the provision in a way that would force the reckoning, and he had placed the draft page in the desk drawer where I would find it because he had believed, even when he could not say it out loud, that I was the daughter who would do the right thing with what he left me. He had been right. I had done it. I was going to spend the rest of my life knowing that he had trusted me to do it. That was the gift. That was the only gift. I want to tell you about the conversation with Beatrice. Beatrice was 43. She was the middle child between Lyle and me, which was its own kind of position in our family, and she had spent her adult life as a clinical psychologist in private practice in the South End, working primarily with women who were, in her own words, navigating the long quiet aftermaths of family arrangements they had been told for decades were normal. I had not told Beatrice anything in the 4 months between my discovery of the draft page and the confrontation with Lyle. I had not told her because I had not been certain, until the morning at Mr. Tomarsik's, what I was actually dealing with. I had not told her after that because Bryony had been clear that, until the legal architecture was in place, the fewer people who knew, the more options I had. Beatrice had, however, been suspecting something for the entire 4 months. I want to be careful when I say this because Beatrice's suspecting is the part of this story that I think about most often when I think about how families know things that they do not know they know. Beatrice had not seen the draft page. Beatrice had not had the document examined by a forensic specialist. Beatrice had not assembled a financial trail on Lyle's hedge fund. Beatrice had, instead, watched my face for 4 months at the small lunches the three of us had been having every other Sunday since our father's death. She had watched the specific tightness around my eyes when Lyle had spoken about the will. She had watched the specific way I had begun, in late June, to redirect conversations away from any topic that touched on the estate. She had watched the way I had stopped, sometime in early July, asking Lyle about the fund. She had been a clinical psychologist for 16 years. She had been my younger sister for 40 years. She had known something was wrong. She had been waiting for me to tell her. I called her on the morning after the confrontation with Lyle. I asked if I could come over. She said of course. I drove to her townhouse in the South End at 10 in the morning. I sat across from her at her kitchen table, in the specific quiet light of a Saturday morning in mid-September, and I told her everything. She listened. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she said, "Cordelia." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have been waiting for this conversation for 4 months." I said, "I know." She said, "Thank you for telling me." She said it without anger. She said it without any of the specific small frustrations I would have expected, given that I had been carrying this for 4 months without telling her. She said, "I want to ask you one question." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why did you go alone?" I sat with the question. I sat with it because the question was the right question, and the right question deserved a real answer. I said, "Beatrice." I went alone because I was afraid that if I told you, you would have wanted to tell Lyle. I went alone because you have spent your professional life believing that confrontation is the path to healing in families, and I needed, for these 4 months, to make decisions that did not assume confrontation was the path. I said, I went alone because I did not know yet what I wanted to do, and I did not want to weigh my decision against the conversation I would have had to have with you about my decision before I had made it. I said, "I am sorry." She said, "Cordelia." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is a fair answer." I want to push back on one part of it. I said, "Push." She said, "I have spent my professional life believing that confrontation is sometimes the path to healing in families. I have also spent it believing that protection is sometimes the path. I have not always communicated the second part as clearly as the first." She said, "You chose protection. You chose it carefully. You chose it for reasons that I would have, if you had told me, supported." She said, "I want you to know that." She said, "I am not hurt that you went alone. I am hurt that you thought I would not have understood why you went alone." I sat across from my sister. I said, "Beatrice, I am sorry." She said, "I know you are." She said, "We are going to talk about this for many years. We are going to talk about it every time we see Lyle from this point forward. We are going to talk about it every time we see Mama. We are going to talk about it every time we have a holiday at the house in Beacon Hill." She said, "I want to make sure that, in all of those conversations, the two of us are on the same side." She said, "Are we on the same side, Cordelia?" I said, "Beatrice, we are on the same side." She said, "Good." She made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table for the next 2 hours. We talked through everything. The forensic report. The financial trail. The settlement document Lyle had signed. The provisions that had been put in place to ensure that the criminal record remained available if Lyle ever breached. By noon, Beatrice and I had aligned on the next steps. The next step was telling our mother. I want to tell you about the conversation with our mother because the conversation with our mother is, in many ways, the most important conversation in this story. Our mother had been operating, for the 4 months since our father's death, under the version of the will that Lyle had filed. She had read aloud, at the family lunch following the will reading, the provision that distributed 62% of the estate to her son. She had done it without knowing. She had done it in good faith. She was going to need to be told what had actually happened. The telling was going to be the hardest part. Beatrice and I drove to our mother's house in Beacon Hill the following Tuesday afternoon. We had told our mother that we wanted to see her about a family matter. We had not told her what. We sat with her in the parlour at the front of the house. The same parlour where she had poured tea for her friends when I was 5 years old and my brother had been 13, and the upstairs of the house had been his and the dining room table had been mine. The parlour was the room that had defined the architecture of our family for 160 years. We told her what had happened in the parlour. Beatrice told her. I had asked Beatrice to be the one who told her. Beatrice had been the clinical psychologist. Beatrice knew how to deliver difficult news to women in their 70s who had recently lost husbands. Beatrice told her in the specific careful way of a daughter who was telling her mother something her mother needed to absorb without being broken by the absorption. Our mother listened. When Beatrice finished, our mother sat very still. She did not cry. She had not cried at the funeral and she did not cry now. She had been a Pemberton woman for 76 years, and Pemberton women, by the long quiet training of their upbringing, did not cry in parlours. She said, "Lyle did this." I said, "Yes." I said, "Yes." She said, "Lyle altered your father's will." I said, "Yes." She said, "Lyle let me read the altered version aloud at the lunch." I said, "Yes." She said, "Lyle has known for 4 months that the version I read aloud was not the version your father wrote." I said, "Yes." She sat with what we had told her for a long moment. Then she said something I have thought about every day since. She said, "I have raised 3 children. I have loved them in different ways. I have not, until this moment, understood what I should have done differently." She said, "I should have made it clear to all 3 of you, from the beginning, that the family money was a family resource and not a Lyle resource. I should have insisted, when your grandfather was alive, that he changed the trust documents during his lifetime. I should have insisted, when your father was alive, that we file the corrected provisions earlier so that the question of what came after him was not left to the discretion of any of you." She said, "I let the architecture of this family stand because the architecture had stood for 160 years. I did not see what the architecture was costing my daughters. I did not see what the architecture was teaching my son." She said, "I am sorry, Cordelia." She said, "I am sorry, Beatrice." She said, "I have spent 76 years being a Pemberton woman and I have not, until today, understood what kind of cost that has imposed on the people I love." She looked at us. She said, "What do you need from me?" I want to tell you what we asked for. We asked for one thing. We asked her to come with us to a family dinner the following Sunday at our brother's house in Brookline. We asked her to come because the family dinner was going to be the dinner at which Lyle was going to deliver, in person, the written admission he had made. We asked her to come because the dinner was going to be the moment at which, in front of the entire family, Lyle's wife, his 2 children, Beatrice's husband, my husband, our mother, The version of the family that we had been operating under for 40 years was going to be replaced by the version of the family that came next. She said, "I will come." She said, "I will come because that is what I should do." She said, "I will come because, for the first time in 76 years, I am going to be the kind of mother that the situation requires." The dinner happened on a Sunday in late September. I am not going to tell you everything that was said at the dinner. The dinner was a family dinner. The dinner belongs to the family. The contents of the dinner are not for the channel. What I will tell you is that Lyle delivered the admission. He read it aloud, at the dining room table, in front of his wife and his children and his sisters and his mother. He read it slowly. He did not embellish it. He did not soften it. He read what he had written. When he was finished, his wife, a woman named Madeline whom I had known for 15 years, stood up from the table. She walked across the room to where I was sitting. She bent down and she put her arms around me. She said, into the side of my hair, "Cordelia, thank you for not destroying him." I said, "Madeline, he had a chance to deserve it." She said, "I know he did." She said, "We are going to spend the rest of our lives making sure he keeps deserving it." She kissed the top of my head. She walked back to her seat beside Lyle. The dinner continued. It was not a comfortable dinner. It was, however, the most honest dinner the Ainsworth Pemberton family had ever had in its 160-year history of dinners in Beacon Hill and Brookline and the various other rooms in which the family had gathered to eat. The honesty was, in itself, the gift. The honesty was the architecture that came next. I want to tell you what I learned. I learned that the families with the longest histories are sometimes the families with the most carefully maintained silences. The silences are the architecture. The silences are what allows the architecture to stand. When the silences are finally named, the architecture has to be rebuilt, and the rebuilding is uncomfortable, and the rebuilding takes years, and the rebuilding produces a different building than the one that had been standing before. The new building is sometimes a better building. The new building, almost always, is a more honest building. The honesty is what allows the people inside it to actually live. I learned that fathers, sometimes, do the long careful work of preparing the corrections that they cannot deliver during their own lifetimes. They draft the provisions. They sign them. They place them in desk drawers where the right daughter will find them. They do this not because they are confident the daughter will use them. They do this because they are confident the daughter is the kind of woman who will know what to do with what she finds. The kind of woman who will know is the kind of woman the father has, often without saying so, spent his lifetime trying to raise. The trying was the gift. The finding of the draft page was the proof that the trying had worked. I learned that the third option is sometimes the option that is most worth taking. The third option is the option that does not feel like victory in the moment. The third option is the option that requires you to hold the loving and the betraying simultaneously. The third option is the option that, in the long quiet years that follow, allows your family to become the family it was always supposed to be. The first option and the second option destroy the brother. The third option destroys the architecture that produced the brother. The destroyed architecture is what produces the brother who comes next. The brother who comes next is sometimes the brother the family always needed. I learned that mothers who have been Pemberton women for 76 years are sometimes, when given the chance, capable of becoming a different kind of woman in a single afternoon in a parlour on Mount Vernon Street. The capability had been in them all along. The architecture had not allowed it to come out. The architecture had kept them performing a kind of woman that the women themselves had not entirely chosen. When the architecture comes down, the women come out. The women who come out are sometimes the women you have been waiting for your whole life. My mother is now 78. She has, in the 4 years since the dinner in Brookline, become a different mother to me and to Beatrice than she had been in the previous for decades. The relationship is not perfect. The relationship is, however, the relationship I have always wanted. She calls me on Sunday afternoons. She asks about my children. She asks about my work, which she had not, in any meaningful way, asked about for the previous 20 years. She has begun to attend the small charitable foundation board meetings that I run in Boston. She has begun to read books that Beatrice recommends. She is becoming, in her late 70s, a woman of her own design. I have been watching it happen. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever watched. I run the Pemberton Foundation now. The foundation was reorganized after the settlement to reflect the redistributed inheritance. Beatrice and I are the two principal trustees. Lyle holds a non-voting position. The foundation funds, primarily, programs supporting women in financially abusive marriages and families. The funding choices, in their specific way, are my father's continued voice in the family. He had not directed us to fund those programs. He had drafted the provision that allowed us to fund them. The drafting was the direction. The desk drawer in my father's study is still in the house in Beacon Hill. The manila envelope is no longer in it. The desk drawer is empty now. I keep it that way,